Hey, the title of this video is a little bit misleading because this game is not from a current but a former student of mine. But it's a game during which he achieved a new all-time high rating of 1535. His name's Mike, and he had the black pieces, and his opponent was a Class B player rated somewhere in the 1600s, who's known at the club at which this game took place for his aggressive attacking style. Mike played c4, and after his opponent played c4, and after knight f6, knight c3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castle, knight f3, and c5. We have, I think, what's called a symmetrical English. And as far as I understand it, if white wants to play for an advantage in this opening, he should strongly consider the move d4 at some point. And if black wants to equalize and then hope afterwards to outplay his opponent and achieve an advantage himself, he should consider the move d5. But Mike's opponent played d3, which is fine. As I've mentioned in the past, when you have a portion of the central pawn structure that's locked, you're usually looking for a pawn break on either side of it. So white could look for d4, but he could also play the move b4. And black could try to play d5 or b5. Knight to c6, rook b1, and this move I think makes it pretty clear that white intends to go for the b2, b4 break. a6 from Mike, bishop to e3, d6 guarding the c5 pawn, and a3, and white is now ready to play b4. I think if Mike had wanted to, he could have played rook b8 here, with the idea that white's b4, either immediately or with preparation, could be responded to with b5, sort of fighting white for control of the queen side and arguing that he's achieved equality by doing that. But knight to g4 from Mike, and it's hard to criticize this move, as whenever there's a white dark squared bishop sitting on e3 and black has the opportunity to attack it with a knight, the move's coming with tempo. White almost never wants that bishop traded off. Bishop to g5 from white, and knight to d4 from Mike, occupying the center with a minor piece. I think, again, here might have been an opportunity to continue with what looks like his plan when he plays a6, which is to get his pawn to b5. But I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with knight d4. It centralizes a minor piece. White castles, black plays h6, and after bishop to d2, plays f5. And I like this move a lot. I don't know if a computer would like it. I haven't checked very much of this game with an engine. But after Mike's knight g4, the move f5 justifies the knight's trip out to g4, because now when it comes back to f6, it's going to be behind the pawn structure and supporting, after an eventual e5, some break by black on f4 or e4, hopefully with an attack on the white king or a way to break down the white center, either way with advantage. Knight h4 from white, king h7, and knight back to f3. Okay, so I think pretty clearly if the knight travels to h4 and immediately back to f3, and if what black does in exchange for that is get in a move which increases king safety and another move of his choice for free, that was not a good idea from white. I think instead white probably should have continued with his plan to play b4. Mike played e5, another nice aggressive move, and what you'll notice as this game continues is that though Mike's opponent's reputation is that of an attacking player, the fact that Mike developed a plan and acted on it put his opponent on the defensive. And I think against all but the strongest opposition you'll find that that's usually the case. Knight takes d4, c takes d4, and knight d5. Okay, a nice move from Mike's opponent, which occupies the d5 square, which is now a nice outpost for him with a knight. But f4 from Mike. Mike's continuing with his plan to put pressure on this white king and to expand on the side of the board on which he has more space. G takes f4 from white, and I can't agree with this move. This g-pawn is performing the very important role of protecting the h4 square, which after g takes f4 becomes occupied immediately by the black queen. And kudos to Mike for finding this energetic move instead of just recapturing on the f4 square. After h3, Mike goes back to f6 with the knight. No harm in that. He's now threatening to take this pawn on h3, and he's considering trading off the powerful white knight on d5. Knight takes f6 from his opponent, and after bishop takes f6, king h2, Mike took back on f4. So if we pause for a second and take a look at the material situation, white's missing one pawn, as is black, so material is even. But black has a lot of pressure on white's king side, and a lot of space over there. And if white's not careful, that will lead to an attack which will at least cost white some kind of material. f3 from white. Okay, so this was probably played because white was afraid of the move f3 from black, followed by bishop to e5, further activating black's pieces. But the move f3 self-entombs the bishop on g2. Notice that now that bishop has no way to get out. It can travel to the h1 square, to the f1 square. But unless white wants to give up at least one pawn, that bishop will never emerge from its imprisonment. Mike chose to play queen g3 check, which is hard to argue with. The queen moves to a more advanced post with tempo. And after king h1, I don't know what I would do here with black. There are two interesting options. One is what Mike chose in the game, which is the win of material with bishop takes h3. But that kind of solves white's problem on g2. An alternative, I think, would be to just kind of play bishop d7 and then maybe put this rook on e8 and play against this e2 pawn and kind of say, well, I still have the option of taking on h3 at some point, but I don't want to help you get rid of this problem. So I'm going to keep developing my pieces and attacking your weaknesses. And eventually, the fact that you're basically down a piece because this one is in prison will lead to me winning something more substantial than a pawn, I guess. Although after Mike's bishop takes h3, which may be correct for tactical reasons because the white king is so exposed, and his opponent's rook g1, Mike played bishop takes g2, rook takes g2, queen h2 check, rook h2, and queen back to f5. Black is clearly much better here with a protected passed pawn, with a target on the e-file, and with an extra pawn. But I was trying to find some way for black to do better than that. Maybe by playing queen h4, with the idea that now we're going to reveal an attack on the white king, and of course if white allows black to have another move, any retreating light-squared bishop move will lead to checkmate. But white gets a move here, of course, and he can try queen e1. And after bishop takes g2 double check, king takes g2, not really sure that there's anything here for black. So I guess Mike's decision to trade on g2 may have been the right thing to do. And then he retreated his queen along the light squares back to the f5 square. One thing I like to mention in my videos sometimes is that when you trade one pair of bishops, the queens take up responsibility for controlling the diagonals of that color. So the white and black queens here are now responsible for controlling the light squared diagonals on the board. Queen to g1 from white, rook a to e8 from black. This is looking better and better for black. All of the black pieces, with the exception of the bishop on f6, are now active, and he's targeting a weakness on e2. And if nothing else, if he ever gets to an endgame with this protected passed pawn on the h-file, he's likely winning. Queen to g4. Mike elects to trade queens. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, except that the white king is vulnerable, so maybe an argument ought to be made that a trade helps white with his defensive task. But it's not bad because now Mike can play bishop to g5. Actually, I guess he was going to play that anyway, wasn't he? Yeah, well, okay, but the queen trade is still not bad because afterwards in bishop g5, black's pieces are better than white's. His opponent played bishop to b4, targeting this doubled pawn on d6. And Mike, I think, here missed an opportunity to play more energetically than he did. He played the move rook f6, protecting the pawn on d6. But what jumps out at me as likely a very good move here is f3. For example, if e takes f3, then after rook takes f3, the d pawn is targeted, and if that pawn drops, that'd be pretty bad news for white because there'd be a passed pawn on d4. There's also a target on g4, and the black pieces are obscenely active. So white would have to do something other, I think, than play e takes f3. I doubt that bishop takes d6 is a good move, as f takes e2 is probably winning. But there is this move rook to f1, which is a little bit difficult to figure out what to do against with black. But there are nice options here. One is f takes e2, after which rook takes f8, rook takes f8, rook takes e2, and bishop to e3 lets white grab this d6 pawn. But if he does, then after rook f1 check, king g2, rook d1, there's no way to protect this pawn on d3, and that white rook is very inactive. And as an alternative, black has bishop to f4, trying to block the f-file and hitting this rook on h2. Black can play rook h to f2, and now white can, and now black can try f takes e2. When rook takes f4 is a big mistake because it allows e takes f1 queen check. But white can play rook e1 and just gobble this pawn up on e2. But black can play, again here, bishop to e3. And if white trades on f8 and then takes that pawn on e2, black's pieces again are extremely active, and I think there's once again rook f1 check, king g2, rook d1. And what's he going to do to hold on to that pawn on d3? And if white instead plays rook f to e2, though there may be some tactical concerns involving the bishop on e3 and the pin along the e-file, I think it's pretty clear that at least right now these white rooks are abysmally placed. They are staring this bishop in the face, but they can't actually capture it because that would result in the loss of material. So I really like the move f3 here. But instead Mike played rook to f6, protecting his d6 pawn, and there's not really anything wrong with that because it's not like the move f3 is going to go away on the following move. White can't come up and protect that square with the king, or he will drop the pawn on e2. His opponent played bishop to a5, no longer attacking the pawn on d6, and now Mike finds and plays f3. E takes f3 from white, rook takes f3. And again, the black pieces here are extremely active. This has got to be winning. Rook to d1, passively defending this pawn on d3. And bishop f4, rook g2, and rook to e5. I wonder if, as an alternative, black could stick this rook on e3 as a way to target the d-pawn and maybe force white to play rook g to d2, which might then allow an attack on the white king. His opponent, though, here played rook e1, which is a blunder. and if you'd like to, see if you can figure out why. Okay, of course the answer is Mike should play rook takes a5, winning a bishop. But Mike instead played rook h3 check, and that may be because he was low on time here. He sometimes suffers from time trouble. And he's also, these days, I think, a stronger player strategically than tactically, though he's been improving his tactics a lot. King to g1 from white, and rook takes d3. Okay, but given that, oh, by the way, I think here there was just another opportunity to take this bishop on a5. Yeah, looks like it. Okay, but after Mike's rook takes d3, and especially after his opponent's rook takes e5 and Mike's d takes e5, Black is now up 2 pawns and has repaired the defect in the central part of his pawn structure and has connected passed pawns on e5 and d4, and is therefore completely winning. King f1 from white, e4 from Mike, and rook f2 from his opponent. And here Mike, again, kind of plays a tactically bad move. He interposes with rook f3. And the problem with this is that after a trade on f3 and king f2, there's no defending the pawn on f3. Black's likely still winning, but why give up that pawn if you don't have to? So I think instead Mike should have played g5, securing the bishop on f4, and only then continuing to advance his pawns in the center. Mike played d3, and after king takes f3, d2, forcing the white king back to e2. And he played b6. I'm not sure that b6 is necessary. I think because white's probably going to take this pawn on d2 anyway, although he should not. But I think just h5 here from Black is a good idea. Black wants to make a passed pawn on the h-file eventually anyway, and this way his king has a slightly more active route to the central files. Mike played b6 instead. Actually, doesn't b6 just hang a pawn? Yeah, I think his opponent should have played bishop takes b6 here. But he played bishop takes d2, and Mike traded on d2 and brought his king to the center. And after king e6, the game was agreed draw. This is not a draw, and I checked with a computer to make sure, because Black should be able to distract the white king with his h-pawn, and then send his king over to gobble up the remaining white pawns, and if nothing else, queen is a pawn. But it was another nice game from Mike, especially strategically, and I want to congratulate him on his new rating high. And I think it won't be all that much longer before he hits Class B. Let me show you his rating graph. I hope you don't mind. I hope he doesn't mind. Here it is. Let me get my face out of the way. This is his US Chess Federation rating graph, and 1535 is his new high. He took quite a dip after his last high, but he's climbed all the way back up and is getting better at tactics. It shouldn't be, judging by the trend in this graph, all that much longer before he hits 1600 for the first time. So congrats, Mike, and thank you for watching.